So I'm just going to start off by saying hi, my name's Jo, and thank you very much for coming along to tonight's presentation with David Smallshire. I can't wait to learn about the dragonflies, especially ones that might occur in the north of Devon, which is where my project is based. So it's a very small project area that I work in. It's called the Conservation Communities Project, and it's 11 parishes that I cover from Great Torrington down to Hatherley. So that's the Torridge and the West Devon areas of Devon. And the idea of the project is that I work with these small communities to try and increase the number of wildlife recordings that have been taking place. And those recordings all get stored with the Devon Biodiversity Records Centre. And one of the things they discovered was they had very few wildlife sightings recorded for these parishes. So this project was launched to see if we could generate some help from the people who live in these areas to see if we can boost the numbers of wildlife records. So to do this, we needed to find ways to engage people, increase their knowledge, and help them to perhaps increase some of the biodiversity in those parishes. So we run all sorts of events, and we try and encourage people to learn a little bit more and to put in the records that they might already have from the past, and ones that they might see over the next few months. Now, if anyone lives in these parishes and would like to borrow our wildlife trail camera, we've got one that we can loan out to you, and you can borrow that, pop it up in your garden or on some private land, and just see if you can capture any of the wildlife. And that would obviously make a very good record, because there's no doubting a photograph, and it makes it a very definite record, which is one of the things that we struggle to do, is to verify some of the records that we get. So if you'd like to borrow the camera, do get in touch. My email's on the bottom of the screen. I should also say that the project is funded by the Heritage Lottery, and it's supported by the Devon Biodiversity Records Centre, and it's hosted by Devon Wildlife Trust. So for those of you who might like to put a record in, just trying to get my screen to move on now, it doesn't seem to want to work. There we go. So those of you who would like to share your wildlife sightings and make a formal record of them, we'd be delighted to have those. And the way to do that is to go to the Devon Biodiversity Records Centre. So that's abbreviated to DBRC, and that's .org.uk. And you'll come to this screen that has these yellow blocks down the side. And the yellow blocks down the side take you on to various subjects. And the third one down says wildlife records, and on there it will take you through how to put a wildlife record in. So you can either put one individual record in of something that you've spotted, or you can fill out a spreadsheet and return it to them with a whole load of records. So anything that you think that you've seen from these parishes or anywhere in Devon, we'd love to hear from you. That would be great and really help us boost our numbers. So if you'd like to know any more about my project, or if you'd like to get in touch with me, you can find out all the information through the Devon Wildlife Trust website, and you'll find the project called Conservation Communities, and it tells you how to get involved, things you might like to do to help. And if you'd like to look at any of our previous recordings of presentations that we've done, then they're all linked on there, so you can find out about all the things that we've done so far since the project started. So the project finishes in December 2022. So we'll be running lots of online talks right the way through until then. And of course, being online, you can join those talks from anywhere in the world, as we've seen this evening. So do keep an eye out. Most of them will be put through Eventbrite, so you'll see them through there, or you can email me and we can get those links sent to you. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm going to now hand you over to David Smallshire, who's going to tell us all about dragonflies. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Okay, has that worked?
Yeah.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you, David.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so folks, this is a widescreen production. So what you can do is minimize the little windows on the right hand side, the thumbnail videos, by going to the top of the video section and just clicking what looks like a minus sign, and that will give you just a black bar. And it does mean that you don't have to look at me all evening, and better still, you can watch what I'm trying to show you on screen. Okay, so welcome, folks. I have put a North in the title. So normally I give a talk covering the whole of Devon, but Joe asked me to give a little bias to you good people up in, well, North West Devon, but I've made it North Devon. I've included a bit of Exmoor, as it were, in this talk. Someone hasn't muted. I can hear them clearing their throat. So if you'd all like to mute, please. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about tonight is partly about the basic biology of dragonflies, and then I'm going to talk about identifying dragonflies, what their preferred habitats are, and then run through the species that you're likely to be coming across up in the north of the county and in the south of the county as well, as it happens. So why am I here talking about dragonflies? Well, I suppose I should acknowledge that logo, bottom right, the British Dragonfly Society is the organisation looking after recording and conservation of dragonflies in Britain. And I've been involved in it since the 1980s, when it was first started. So I'll talk a bit more about the BDS right at the end. So, okay, so I know I'm slightly biased here, but dragonflies are beautiful. They are very exciting. They are really very photogenic, as anybody who's taken pictures of them will attest. But they are also challenging to identify, which is part of the attraction for many people, including, I have to say, myself. They're pretty big as insects go, and that makes them nice insects to study. Some people might be turned on by the way dragonflies are turned on. They are predators, both as the aquatic larval stage and in the adults that fly away at this time of year. Most of the species are good water quality indicators, although not all of them. They are, however, by and large, good indicators of climate change. So in a positive way, responding to hotter climates, which of course isn't necessarily good for everything on this planet. And they are ancient insects. So they were flying around at the time of the dinosaurs over 300 million years ago, or at least their early ancestors were. Okay, so let's have a look at what dragonflies are. Well, in Britain, we've made a slight nomenclature boob, I believe, in calling them all dragonflies, whereas actually what we include within this group are also damselflies. So the odonata, or the toothed ones, are broken down into the dragonflies and the damselflies. And you can see on the right there, typical emperor dragonfly. It has its wings held out at right angles to the body. And you'll notice that the front wings are slightly smaller, narrower than the hind wings, so a different shape. The small red-eyed damselfly at the bottom is a typical damselfly. All four wings are identical, and in most species, they're held together over the abdomen. Now, globally, we think there could be as many as 7,500. The taxonomists haven't got quite as far as describing them all yet. And most of these, perhaps not too surprisingly for a cold-blooded insect, are found in the tropics. We have, in fact, less than 150 breeding species in Europe. So Europe is rather depauperate in the dragonfly sense. But about a third of those breed in the UK, on top of which we have a scattering of vagrants, including one species from North America and others from Africa. So of that 48, we have 29 breeding species in Devon. That's not quite half damselflies and rather more than half dragonflies. And again, we've had 9 rarities, although 2 of those species have actually laid eggs, but that doesn't prove successful breeding, of course. those eggs may not survive through to adulthood. And sadly, we've lost one that's been lost to Britain now, the orange spotted emerald that was once found on the Tamar. Okay, let's go back to our emperor dragonfly. So you can see here it's a typical insect. Its body is divided into three parts: the head, thorax, and abdomen. The thorax has those 4 wings and, of course, 6 legs attached to it. And the abdomen is divided into 7 fairly well recognizable segments. And there are also terminal appendages at the tip. Near the tip of the wings, you will see a dark cell. And this is technically known as the pterostigma, which literally means wing spot. So it's a good name, really. The spot towards the end of the wing. Damselflies also have wing spots, and indeed their body is also divided up in the same way, of course, as the dragonfly. One additional feature that I'll mention again a bit later is the pronotum, and that's a plate covering the front end of the thorax. So, fearsome hunters and great flyers. The adults here I'm talking about, although the larvae also hunt for invertebrate prey. So they have huge eyes enabling that ability to detect prey very easily, very rapidly, and also spot a potential partner and maybe also a rival for a potential partner. So they're quite fearsome creatures. They can fly in some cases for hours on end. And in the case of the emperor dragonfly, there top right, they can actually feed on the wing as well. So they can keep themselves on territory for quite prolonged periods. The damselfly there, bottom right, showing that even as adults, they have quite fearsome jaws. You may well have seen the articulated jaws of larvae in videos of them streaking out and catching a tadpole or a fish and bringing it back to be eaten. The legs are armed with hairs, or in some cases quite prominent spines. And if you can imagine 6 legs being brought together to catch prey, a flying insect, anything up to the size of a butterfly, then that prey can be caught quite effectively and efficiently and brought to the jaws. The tip of each leg, as with many insects, has 2 very sharp claws, and they have an amazing grip, astonishingly strong grip. The wings themselves are remarkable structures. As I mentioned earlier, the basic form of dragonflies has not changed dramatically since those 300-million-year-old critters, some of which were the size of a kestrel. So quite sizable insects being able to fly around in the thinner oxygen layer. The wings themselves evolved very quickly to be long and thin and corrugated. So they're not flat structures. They're not delicate, at least once they've hardened off after emergence. They're really very, very robust structures. And if you look particularly at those top 2 images, you'll see the veins at the front of the wing are strengthened. They're almost like RSJs for those of you in the building trade. So they have a right-angled joist affair to make them stronger. They have that wing spot towards the tip, and they also have a break point halfway along these wings at the node, so you can actually see in the bottom right image, I hope, a little nick, and the wing can actually fold at that point. So if it needs to brush its wing back for whatever reason, dive into the bush or something, then the wing is not going to snap in half. So I mentioned they have peculiar breeding habits. Here's a mating pair of common blue damselflies. So I think to explain this, we have to look a bit more closely at the differences between males and females. So males have what are known as secondary or accessory genitalia positioned under the base of the abdomen. And here they place sperm before they actually mate. So this is a unique feature in dragonflies. This is an emerging four-spotted chaser. So this is in what's known as the resting phase, where it's hardening off prior to pumping its wings up. And I've put a ring around the accessory genitalia there. So even at this stage, we know this is a male four-spotted chaser. Damselflies have the same, this bulge underneath the tip of the abdomen. Now let's contrast that with the females. So on the right-hand side, 3 example damselfly species, and you can see quite a bulging ovipositor. All of the damselflies and the hawker dragonflies, the big robust ones, and golden ringed dragonfly, which I'll come back to later. These all have a very strong ovipositor that's designed for injecting eggs into usually plant material, sometimes debris. And as I say, that's typically a bulge under the tip of the abdomen, although in the case of the golden ring, it has this peculiar spiked tail, as the Americans call golden ring dragonflies spiked tails. Quite a good name, really, after the female's ovipositor. And they use that to literally bounce up and down as if on a pogo stick and inject the eggs into gravel in the bottom of a stream. The other groups of dragonflies, the darters and skimmers and chasers, which I'll mention later, the eggs are dipped into the water in flight, and they come from what's known as a vulvar scale, again under the tip of the abdomen. So there's a blue-tailed damselfly, female on the right, showing quite a thickened abdomen compared with the male. The male has a very slender waist, as it were. I wish I had still. I used to, but old age and all that. So the females are more robust in the abdomen than the males, and that, of course, is because they're full of eggs. Their eggs are developing within the abdomen. Let's look at the tip of the male's abdomen. They all come with claspers of some description. In the case of the damselflies, there are 2 pairs, an upper pair and a lower pair, and these are used to grasp that pronotum. So I mentioned that earlier. That's the plate at the front of the thorax. And you can see on the emerald damselfly quite complex structures. And these are very precisely shaped to fit the shape of the pronotum of the female that they want to mate with. So this, in theory, prevents interbreeding. It doesn't stop some species, particularly things like the emerald damselfly, which has rather large appendages, from trying to grab anything and everything, even dragonflies on rare occasions, but usually its own species, to be fair. Dragonflies link up slightly differently. They have 2 upper appendages and 1 lower, and the 2 upper appendages fit rather neatly behind the eyes of the female, and the lower appendage sits on top of the head. So this ability to link up in what we call in tandem is, oh, sorry, I should go back to the pronotum briefly, just to show you in detail what I'm talking about here. I've already explained that the shapes of the female pronotums are unique to those species. So the first stage in mating is for a male to grab a female by the scruff of the neck, as it were. I've already explained, in slightly different areas, the pronotum or the back of the head. And this is what's known as in tandem, rather nice phrase. They aren't technically mating at this stage. This is what you see as a precursor to mating, or you will sometimes see following mating, when the males keep hold of the females to prevent other males grabbing her and mating with her. So the mating in particular involves this linkage. The wheel position, it's sometimes known, or if you're a romantic at heart, then the heart position. So the female has brought the tip of her abdomen up to the male's secondary genitalia, and then they will copulate. And that may be, in the case of common darters, it may be for 20 minutes. In the case of some chasers, it's only a few seconds and happens in flight. But in some species like the damselflies, the blue-tailed damselfly in particular, can mate for much longer periods, and sometimes 2 or 3 hours, and even as much as, you can see, 6 hours in the case of one pair that were followed. That must have been rather boring for the observer, I suspect. So what happens in these lengthier matings is that sperm, if it exists already in the female, is whipped out by the male and then his own inserted. But if it's a very quick mating, then there will be no sperm dispersal beforehand. So following that, the females are then almost immediately ready to lay eggs. So you can see here a bunch of white-legged damselflies laying their eggs into some rotten wood. And quite often you'll see groups of damselflies together doing that. Quite often it's into living plant material, so surface pondweeds, as in the case of the azure damselflies on the right. So in most species, certainly damselflies, the males will stay attached. Though some species typically will separate and the females will lay alone. So blue-tailed damselflies, for example, are in that category. Occasionally, the females will go underwater, and sometimes they will take the male part way at least underwater. Now, both of these images are actually rather unusual. It's more common for azure damselflies to lay their eggs above water into the stems of rushes, and the eggs subsequently hatch, and the little pro-larva that comes out will find its way down into the water. On the right, they're rather unusually laying eggs into a woody twig, a willow twig. That's something usually reserved for the recent colonist to southeast Britain, the willow emerald, which lays its eggs into the bark of willow and other trees. So here's a series of 3 images going top left to bottom right of a pair of common blue damsels. The female goes under the water, and the male actually, rather than go under completely himself, will remain above water. And the female takes a layer of air underneath with her. You can often make out the silveriness of the wings, which have a sort of air layer trapped between them. And they're able to stay under for anything up to half an hour. And of course, they may be quite exhausted after that, and indeed have to maybe get back through the surface tension, the meniscus, which is quite difficult for them to get out of. So in the case of common blue damselflies, the females struggling at the surface are rescued by patrolling males. Excuse me. So during the summer months, over larger ponds and lakes, you will see these little bright blue matchsticks whizzing low over the surface of the water. And these will almost invariably be common blue damselflies searching for females. And so they rescue their damsels in distress and take them back to shore for them to dry off. I have to confess they do remain linked up and will expect favours in return for the rescue. Here's an emperor dragonfly injecting eggs into a broad-leaved pondweed stem. Some of the other similar hawkers will lay eggs into the debris, the organic debris, sometimes moss at the sides of a pond. And as I mentioned earlier, the golden ring does this pogo stick trick, stabbing eggs into the base of streams and flushes. Here's a pair of common darters, still in tandem, egg laying. And you may well have seen pairs, or sometimes just the female alone, repeatedly dipping the tip of the abdomen into the water. And each time they dip through the meniscus, they will insert an egg or two, or maybe three, which will then free fall down through the water column. And they're slightly sticky and will stick to anything that they touch on the way down. So let's talk about the life in the water now. I think we have to remember that dragonflies actually spend most of their lives underwater. So within a few weeks, generally, or in some species over winter, they will hatch, and out comes a rather tadpole-like prolarva, very tiny little thing, the size of the egg, of course, breaks free of the egg, and as soon as it's down in the water, it molts into a tiny nymph. So first of maybe a dozen larval stages. And when it gets towards often about the 12th final stage, the instar, then you can see the developing wings visible in what are known as wing sheaths, so little wing buds at the base of the abdomen. In most species, they will spend 1 or 2 years underwater. The extreme cases, the emerald damselflies, which overwinter as eggs and hatch in the spring, can mature as larvae in about 10, maybe 12 weeks. So they hatch in late winter, early spring, and then by mid to late summer, they're emerging out of their ponds. The golden ring dragonfly often lives in rather impoverished upland streams where food is scarce. And indeed, like many predators, snakes, for example, they will grow as quickly as the food allows them to. So if there's a plentiful supply, they can grow more quickly. So again, just to emphasize, let's not forget that they spend most of their lives underwater. So it's a really important habitat for them. The larvae come in 3 basic types. The damselfly has 3 little tails at the end. The dragonflies are either torpedo-like or spider-like, so 2 rather basic descriptions, which I think describe them fairly well. So there's some photos of them. The damselfly has those 3 tails, usually 3, sometimes they'll lose 1 or 2 or even 3 of them. These are used for getting oxygen out of the water, so they're external gills. And then they're also used as a swimming aid, rather like flippers. The hawker types and darters both breathe through the rear end, and they can actually eject water forcibly and shoot through the water as if with jet propulsion. So the hawker types are mostly very active hunters, whereas the others, the squat, rather spidery ones, may live in mud or sand or other debris at the bottom. And sometimes you'll find them crawling around on the vegetation, hunting like the torpedo types. So the larval requirements cover most types of water. I should stress fresh water. We have a very few that are capable of tolerating brackish conditions, but none at least in Britain, can tolerate salt water. I think for those people living in America, you do have one species that occurs in tidal waters. But in this country, fresh waters typically unpolluted, though there are one or two species that can tolerate a degree of pollution. And generally speaking, because we're in temperate climes here, they like their water warmed up, so not heavily shaded as a rule. So that encompasses both still waters, ponds, lakes, ditches, perhaps, or flowing waters, rivers and streams. What is quite important to many of them is the architecture of the vegetation beneath the surface. Some are a little bit fussy about the types of vegetation, but by and large, those that need to crawl around in it need something to crawl around in. So it's very important to have things alive under the water. And of course, pond weeds are very important in doing that, as well as oxygenating the pond and providing food for other organisms. Some live in the organic debris or the mineral sediment at the bottom of the water. They do, as you might have guessed, need plenty of food, so a good supply of invertebrates. So that's not just insects or their larvae, but anything from little worms and even, of course, fish, little fish in the case of some of the larger species. So the occasional vertebrate, tadpoles as well. And they don't like to be eaten. So having relatively low numbers of fish and newts is quite important to them. Even frogs will take the adults when they're terrestrial, when they're emerging. Frogs by the side of my pond, actually that's my garden pond, bottom left, and I've watched frogs sitting out of the water, taking the odd damselfly as it emerged, as well as spiders and other things. So they do need, very importantly, places to emerge, and very often it's an emergent plant, maybe just a nice thin rush, or it could be something thicker like an iris, a yellow iris leaf. Occasionally they'll climb up something bigger like a tree trunk or an artifact, a wooden stake, for example, in the water, or a rock. So this is a sequence of images showing the emergence of an emperor dragonfly. So the most important thing is for the larva to get its very sharp claws, those I mentioned earlier, around an appropriate stem, so something of the right dimensions. So this emperor has chosen quite a broad leaf to cling onto. It will wriggle its abdomen around from side to side to make sure it's not obstructed. And it will, of course, be using its eyes to make sure that there's nothing else likely to get in the way of its emergence. So using its body fluids, which it redistributes, it expands the thorax and literally bursts out of the back of the thorax. And it hangs back in that position, allowing the cuticle to harden off for maybe half an hour. And then it lunges forward quickly, grabs hold of usually the front end of its exoskeleton, and then pulls out the tip of the abdomen. And then it does some more redistribution of its body fluids. First of all, it pumps up its abdomen, and then it pumps up its wings. So you can see it's now approximately twice the length of the larval skin that it crawled out of. The final stage will be for it to open its wings. In the case of a dragonfly anyway, it will flick its wings open and then it's ready to fly away. And that process takes maybe 2 to 3 hours. And it does need good weather. It's very important that it does have good weather. The emperors and hawkers will do most of their emergence at night and fly away at first light. Sometimes you'll see them emerging during daylight hours. And in the case of damselflies and the other dragonflies, that's usually going to happen during the mornings, sometimes in the afternoons if the weather's been bad in the morning. So here's the same process here with a damselfly, a common blue damselfly emerging. They don't have that backwards leaning resting phase. They just lunge forward, and when they're hard enough, when the legs are hard enough, they'll pull the abdomen out and then expand everything. You can also note here, because of the lighting on this, the hairs, the downiness of the head and the thorax here. And it's quite common when you get close up and look at insects to see a lot of sensory hairs. In the case of some of the early emerging dragonflies and damselflies, it's likely that the downiness helps to keep them warm, or rather helps them to warm up in cooler weather. So here's a clip from a good book that I'll mention again later, but it's just to show you that the larvae and the exuviae, now an exuvia is the cast skin of the larva, so it's that exoskeleton that's left behind. So you can use these to identify them, you can collect them, count them, and the most important thing about that is that you will prove that something has bred at that particular water. So we can use the shapes, the forms, the sizes of them to tell the species apart. And in many cases, not so easy with the damselflies because they're smaller, but in many cases you can do this in the field, especially if you've got a hand lens. So here's a newly emerged white-legged damselfly on the left, and on the right, a four-spotted chaser after it's taken its maiden flight. So the maiden flight is often only a few meters or tens of meters. In the case of dragonflies, they will be very fluttering because the wings retain quite a lot of liquid, makes them shiny and rather fluttering, not the zippy fast flight that you associate with adult dragonflies in particular. But that's designed to take them away from water, and hopefully it does that safely. Of course, I should say that there is huge mortality between the numbers of eggs laid and the numbers of adults that finally make it to maturity and breeding. So there's pictures of common darters. The top two are tenorals. So these are the immature stages of both the male on the left and the female on the right. And then at the bottom, the mature colours. So just to show you that males in particular will change colour often dramatically with maturity. In the case of the common darter, which is our commonest little red damselfly of late summer. The males can be quite red. The females can, although they start off yellowish and ochre coloured, can end up quite dull. And some will even become reddish like the males. There are variations in colour in female dragonflies, or in particular damselflies. Some dragonflies also have colour forms which are more like the males, so rather more brightly coloured in some cases. But here you can see female forms of the blue-tailed damselfly. These also come in a much duller brown form. So these can be a little bit confusing. So some clues for identifying dragonflies. So one of the first things is, does it perch or does it fly up and down and you have difficulty actually seeing it perched? The flyers are relatively few, I suppose. Most of our dragonflies and all of our damselflies are perchers. So check what time of year it is, look at phenology charts. So see whether your species should be flying in the month when you're watching it. Check whether it should be in that part of the world. It's always quite useful to look at a distribution map. And habitat. So if you're in a really rare specialist habitat, you might find some rare specialist species. But in general, if you're in a fairly common habitat, that's perhaps not of the highest quality, an artificial habitat perhaps, then you will expect it to be one of the commoner generalist species. Though there is a little rider there, is that some species wander. These things, of course, have got wings. Some of them are capable of traveling very large distances, maybe even between continents. But certainly those generalist species are much more likely to wander. So the commoner species are more likely to find suitable habitat as they wander around the country. And these are the ones that are more likely to be spreading in the light of climate change too. Interestingly, the species of running waters are also rather more likely to wander some kilometres away from water. And then birders will recognise the term chiz, which is the character that's rather difficult to learn, but each species tends to have its characteristics. Hard to explain, hard to describe, but you will learn with experience. Might take you 20 or 30 years, but it's worth trying. So how to watch them? Well, again, in our temperate climate, I think the last few weeks will have been abundantly clear to us that you do need warm weather to see insects. I fear we are in probably the worst spring of my life. I can't remember a colder May than we've had, at least up until today. So basically, you're looking for nice weather during those main summer, spring through to early autumn months. Sunny, calm, warm. I always say 17 degrees Celsius is the magic temperature for dragonflies and many butterflies and other insects too. And we have barely reached 17 degrees this year. So not good so far, but hopefully it will be. The hours around the middle of the day, of course, are going to be the warmest. So that's when dragonflies are most active. When you're trying to get close to dragonflies, get the sun behind you. You will see the colours more correctly. They won't be silhouetted, of course, then. But of course, you've got to be careful not to cast a shadow. They have incredibly good eyesight, as I said earlier, and they will see you coming, especially, of course, if you've got a camera. Anyway, so to help you, wear somber clothing. Don't go out in your white shirt. Most importantly, avoid sudden movements. So their eyesight being good, they're very adept at picking up sudden movements. So you need to stalk your prey. If you've got some binoculars, ideally some close focus binoculars, use them. They're great for getting better views of things. If you've got a modern digital camera, take some photos. You can check the critical features. Even dare I say, phone cameras are capable of coming up with quite good pictures these days. But it is important to try and get the dragonfly in focus and to try and see as much of it as possible. And of course, there are field guides and online resources to help you. And at that point, I just have to mention that particular field guide. I should say there are other field guides available to purchase, but I recommend that one for obvious reasons. And it's important, as Joe said at the beginning, to note down what you see and report your sightings. And you can do that either to the Devon Biodiversity Record Centre or through other ways through the British Dragonfly Society's recording scheme, for example. So you could, if you got really interested, join the BDS and indeed go to field meetings. And although we haven't had any for a year or so now, there will be some coming. Okay, so these are the species that we have breeding up in the north of Devon. That's actually most of the species that actually breed in the whole of the county. And we have a couple of red list species, so scarce species nationally, the scarce blue-tailed and the scarce chaser, found at a few locations. So there's the picture I had right at the beginning. We've got 12 basic types of dragonflies, 6 damselflies, rather conveniently, and 6 dragonflies. So the blue-tailed, the blue damselflies, and the red-eyed damselflies come with a fair bit of blue on them, in the case of the males, this is. The demoiselles are big, fluttery. The emerald damselflies are the rule breakers. They're the ones that hold their wings out at about 60 degrees rather than fold them over their body. And then we've a couple of red damselflies, one of which is common and one of which is rare. On the dragonflies, we've got top right, the hawkers and emperors. So these are the big boys, along with the golden ringed dragonfly, which is sort of one on its own, a little bit different to the hawkers and emperors. And we have the chasers, the broad-bodied chaser there. And then skimmers, rather similar, but a little bit smaller and slimmer. And then the darters, 2 of which are red, and 1 is black, 3 of which are red, actually. And then at bottom right, finally, we have 1 emerald damselfly, the downy emerald, which is actually very local. And I'm sorry, it doesn't occur in North Devon. You have to come down south for that one. So just to give you some idea of how important the types of habitats are, then this is it's a rather subjective view of how important they are. So rivers and streams, although globally are very important for dragonflies, not so good in Britain, and indeed a bit better in Europe. And I think ours suffer from probably a history of pollution in many cases. Canals and ditch systems, we also have some quite important areas for. Artificial lakes and ponds, and in fact, a lot of these habitats are artificial when you look down at it. Some of those lakes and ponds might actually be, 100 years old, but they are nevertheless quite artificial in origin, as are the old tin and clay workings that we see in limited areas of Devon. And then in the higher and lowland heath areas, so up on the moors and the heaths of lowland Devon, we have these acidic flushes and mires and pools and these lovely runnels and springs, which are, because they're acidic, are too acidic for fish, which is a real bonus. As I said earlier, if you're a dragonfly, it means there's nothing in the fish line about to gobble you up. So there's another look at my garden pond. And I reckon if you've got a reasonable garden pond, it should have at least half a dozen breeding species of dragonfly. If your pond hasn't, then you must try harder. Dig more ponds, dig a bigger pond. So one of the most widespread pond and ditch species is the large red damselfly. It happens to be the earliest one that emerges in the spring. So we've even had these emerge at the very end of March, but typically in April. So the ones that emerged in April this year, I fear, are probably nearly all dead now because of the horrible weather that's followed. I can only hope that some of them managed to reproduce before they succumbed. But this importantly has black legs, and it has some black markings on the tip of the abdomen, and also the wing spots are black. The females, slightly variable, but mostly black and red. And it helps, of course, if your female is linked to a much more easily identifiable male. The blue-tailed damselfly here. Now, the blue-tail does what it says on the tin, although the blue is not quite at the tip of the abdomen, to be fair. It also has very interesting wing spots. So it has a blue segment, and the females, as I said earlier, come in two different or several different colour phases, most of which also have the blue segment towards the tip of the tail. So these are very common, Catholic in their tastes. I've seen them apparently breeding just downstream of untreated sewage outflow. So I think they're probably quite tolerant of their habitat. The female, as I said, usually has a blue subterminal segment, though sometimes it's brownish. And going back to the wing spot, particularly in the male, you'll see they are two-tone. So a little mnemonic is a two-tone pterostigma, if you can remember the pterostigma word. But the two-tone is unique in this part of the world to our blue-tailed damselflies. And as I said earlier, these mate for longer than other species. So if you see mating damselflies, particularly later in the day, in the afternoons and into the evening sometimes, they will almost invariably be blue-tailed damselflies. So now we come to the blue damselflies. Now the default blue damselfly in ponds and ditches, small ponds and ditches, is the azure damselfly. Now you'll have to bear with me while I describe why I call this the snooker player. First of all, it has a narrow blue stripe, which is nothing to do with it being the snooker player. But it does have something vaguely resembling a dicky bow or a bow tie, and all good snooker players wear a bow tie. And it also has a beer glass. Now you have to imagine looking straight down on that abdomen, and there is a square U shape, which looks like a beer glass in cross section. Now it's not to be confused with the common blue damselfly, which is very common, but not very common at small ponds, garden ponds and ditches. It's very common at large ponds and lakes. And it's distinguished by having two completely blue segments, so no bow tie. It has a very broad blue stripe on the shoulders, as it were, on the top of the thorax. And instead of a beer glass, it's got something vaguely resembling an apple or a mushroom. Hard to see, I have to say, that abdominal shape. But there's our azure damselfly again with a narrow stripe. So it also has a billiard cue. So this is where the snooker player, billiard player comes in. It's got this little black spur, if you like, on the side of the thorax. The common blue damselfly has its mushroom or apple shape, that broad stripe, but no billiard cue. It's plain blue side instead of that black spur. And again, the tip of the abdomen, just to show the sort of dicky bow shape. Actually, looking at that particular one, it's almost like a bat. Anyway, dicky bow will help you think of the snooker player. So that combination, particularly the strength of the blue stripes on top of the thorax and that little black spur on the side, are good field marks. Binoculars, of course, help you to see those. The females, well, not quite so straightforward, but look at those thoraxes again, and you can see the unmarked side of the common blue damsel and that broad pale stripe on the shoulders there. The common blue damselfly also has what I call dandare rocket shapes. Those of a certain era will know what I mean by dandare. These are the classic schoolboy rocket shapes from the comic, where a certain space traveller existed in my youth anyway, and more straight-sided in the case of the azure damselfly. But a little warning is these are both sort of bluish in base colour, but they do come in different forms, some of them quite dull, brownish or olivey coloured. The broad-bodied chaser is perhaps one of the more familiar dragonflies of ponds in spring. It's very much a specialist of early successional stages. So dig a new pond and it will find it. If you live anywhere south of the south of southern Scotland anyway, it will find it. And I've heard of people who've dug a pond in the spring, filled it with water, and within an hour there's been one of these on territory next to it. So they have an amazing ability to find new ponds. They have a broad abdomen, so there's the broad body of the broad-bodied chaser. So it's actually quite flattened, but depressed, but broad from above. And all of the chasers, we have 3 species of chasers in Devon. They all have dark at the wing bases, and it's most apparent in the broad-bodied chaser. There's the female, and in fact the immature males will also look like this when they first emerge. So they share the broad body, but they have this lovely ochre coloration with yellow fringes to the abdomen. And they're also quite likely to be seen away from water. You'll sometimes disturb these from the top of a small bush or shrub, and they'll buzz around and maybe alarm you because of the perhaps hornet-like coloration, admittedly a bit bigger than a hornet. And interestingly, this one, although it's perfectly able to fly, has got deformed hind wings. So wing deformities are not that uncommon in dragonflies. If they're severe, then it will hamper their ability to fly. The common darter we've also seen earlier. So this is a very common pond species. And as I say, the default red darter of late in the year from June onwards into the autumn, even as late as December at times. So these typically, the males have 2 yellow patches on the side of the thorax with a dark panel in between. They have not black legs, but rather dark brown legs, usually with a paler stripe, a yellow stripe sometimes visible. They're also quite fond of getting warmth from either a piece of wood, so a fence post, or a person. In this case, me, in my youth, that must have been taken a good decade ago. The one on the right, I sat down on a bench and this came and just landed on my hand. It had been sitting on the bench beforehand and came and sat on me instead. So they're seeking a little bit of warmth, and they will often bask in the autumn months. This one did exactly the right thing beside my garden pond. It had been sitting on the concrete underneath there. So I put my newly acquired British Dragonfly Society hat right where it was perching, and within seconds it was back landing in the classic position. Another frequent visitor to garden ponds is this rather spectacular beast, the southern hawker. So this is one of our most colourful dragonflies, one of our biggest, and also quite challenging. And they will come and challenge you if you enter their territory, basically. So they will sometimes come and fly and hover right in front of you at sort of waist height. They have what I call headlights and tail lights. They also have a golf tee at the base of the abdomen, so a yellow triangle shape, which is rather hard to see. But much more obvious are these patches of colour at the front and back of the critter. So at the front, they have these large headlights, these shoulder stripes, very bold. And at the tip of the tail, too, in the case of the male, completely blue segments across the tip. And those in combination tell you it's a southern hawker. And there's one hovering in front of me by my garden pond. So you can see how those bold colour patches can be seen quite easily, even with the naked eye. Now, you don't always see these at rest, but when you do, you can appreciate their colours and patterning rather more. So as I mentioned earlier, it does help if you've got a camera handy and you can capture everything rather than try and write it down in the notebook or retain it in your memory. So the female comes in this lovely plain chocolate and lime coloration. And the one on the left is laying eggs into a piece of rotten wood just above the waterline. And this is typical of the hawkers. They'll lay above the waterline in the autumn in the expectation that the water level will rise with the autumn rains and the eggs will then hatch. I'm going to show you a few distribution maps. So just to show you that although southern hawker was once true of this species, so look at those blue dots, the dark dots there are showing you where it used to be before this millennium. And the red dots in the north and west, but particularly in the north into Scotland, are where it's appeared since the year 2000. So one of a good suite of species that's been spreading northwards. So let's look at larger ponds and lakes now. So I've mentioned the common blue damselflies. Here's a pair in tandem, rather somberly coloured female there, maybe with a little bit of debris, sediment on the wings and tip of the abdomen where she's been in the water and laid eggs already. So they can mate multiple times and also lay eggs on multiple occasions over a period of days or even weeks if they're lucky enough. So again, just to stress, the unmarked side of the thorax is a really good field mark. The emerald damselflies, so I said earlier, these are the rule breakers, female, rather bronzy, pale yellow coloured males, iridescent green with some powder blue pruinescence, as it's called. This is a waxy blue exudate that comes through the cuticle and colours the males as they mature. So there's that powder blue coloration at each end of the abdomen. The emperor we were introduced to earlier. So the emperor is, in terms of bulk, I suppose, our biggest dragonfly. And it has a plain green thorax, so no black markings, just plain green. And the abdomen is blue with a black marking down the center. So when you see one in flight from the side, it looks rather more blue and green than the other dragonflies you're likely to see. As I mentioned earlier, it will patrol actively on territory, seemingly for hours on end, and it will catch prey. So if an unsuspecting butterfly happens to wander across its pond or lake, it may grab it and eat it in flight, and you'll see the wings severed and then fall away to the ground or into the water. The black-tailed skimmer. Skimmers do what they say. They skim low over the water. Black-tailed skimmer has a black tip to the abdomen. So it's got a pruinose abdomen. It's got that pale blue coloration. Notice the absence of black in the wing bases. So it's not a chaser. I mentioned earlier all the chasers have dark wing bases. So it's not a chaser. And there's a rather more southerly distribution, rather more scattered in Devon. It's particularly fond of sand and gravel and clay pits, and the males will bask, although in the case of the image here, this one's basking on a fisherman's platform. The four-spotted chaser, again, does what it says on the tin. It's got 4 spots. It's got 4 extra spots at the nodes, as well as the 4 wing spots towards the tip. And it has the characteristic chaser dark markings at the wing base. Now, this is unusual species, or relatively unusual, in that both the male and the female are identical, or virtually identical, just slight difference in the shape of the abdomen and the appendages. The migrant hawker is a late summer hawker. It's one of the last species to emerge, typically not appearing before the end of July and flying into October, November. It's also, unlike most other species, not highly territorial. So you'll see lots of them together around water and over water, as well as feeding away from water, sometimes in the company of other species, to be fair, but often seen in little groups. Another similar southern distribution, it's colonised parts of Ireland and the north of England. And indeed, going back 50 or more years, it was principally a migrant species, but probably with an ameliorating climate, it's become a resident, and as you can see, has definitely moved further north. But we can distinguish it from the southern hawker by the fact that it only has side lights. So no headlights on the top of the thorax, very poor yellow markings. It also has a sort of golf tee marking here at the base of the abdomen, difficult to see. And there it is in flight, and it does tend to fly with the tip of the abdomen held above horizontal, so sort of rather up tilted, and you can see the side of the thorax quite a lot of brown showing as well as yellow. This is an illustration really showing lily pads. So floating vegetation important for one particular species. So this is the red-eyed damselfly that likes lily pads. Sometimes the big leaves of broad-leaved pondweed will suffice. And it has a very dark thorax with no pale stripes on it, and blue right at the tip of the abdomen. So this is the male, and they do have lovely red eyes when you get the light at the right angle. So here's the red-eyed damselfly. It's become slightly pruinescent, a slight bloom, a sort of bloom like you get on plums along the abdomen there. But red eyes, blue right at the tip of the abdomen. A rather local species though, because of its requirement for water lilies, and only just getting into North Devon really. So it's along the Grand Western Canal, which technically, in terms of the old Vice County boundaries, that links North Devon to South Devon. But it has been found at some fishing ponds in the north of the county. We also have a new kid on the block, the small red-eyed damselfly with a little bit more blue towards the tip of the abdomen. Now, this first appeared in Britain in 1999, so it's only been around for a couple of decades, and it got to Devon about 50 years ago. You can see here, this one is actually on a water lily leaf, but quite often they're actually sitting on algal, surface algae and other plants. But with binoculars, look for this wedge of blue towards the tip of the abdomen. And also from above, there's a black X shape. And there's the red-eyed damselfly for comparison, just to show the absence of that blue wedge towards the tip of the abdomen. The distribution, it's made phenomenal headway. That was actually the distribution in 2012. It's got a little bit further, and it has been found in the Crediton area and is quite likely to be appearing. It's also turned up now in Plymouth and in Cornwall, so it's quite likely to be more widespread than that map shows. And it's not particularly fussy about the type of ponds and lakes that it frequents. So I've actually got a picture of North Devon here. This is one of the flooded pits at Meath and the Devon Wildlife Trust Reserve. And a couple of species worth mentioning here. In the last couple of years, there have been sightings of ruddy darter. Now, ruddy darter is, for some reason, very uncommon in Devon and Cornwall ditto, but much commoner in Somerset and Dorset. So in adjacent counties, quite common and widespread in some places, but here very localized and proven to breed in very few locations. So it's actually been found in the past at Braunton Burrows in some of the ponds there. And for the last couple of years at Meath. So how do we tell this from a common darter? Well, look at its legs, they're solid black. So no sign of brown or a pale stripe. You might see some glint on them, but that's all. The abdomen is indeed a blood red and often rather narrow at the base, a bit shorter generally than the common darter too. And a pink face, bright red eyes, reddy brown eyes, and a reddish brown thorax. So altogether redder and ruddy sums it all up, very reddish species. The female, very similar to common darter, but she does have black legs, and she also has, as does the male, black coming down along the side of the eye there, the edge of the eye on the side of the face, which it doesn't in common darter. So you need a jolly good view or picture to be able to see that, to be fair. But the black legs are the giveaway. And there's the map showing you how it becomes strangely local in the west of Britain, including Wales, but it's actually widespread in Ireland, so very strange distribution. Hard to explain. This beauty is the red-veined darter. So this is another new kid on the block. Essentially a Mediterranean species if we go back 30, 40, 50 years ago, but it's spread north in Europe and is colonizing Britain. It's unusual in that it seems to work on the basis of 2 generations per year. So a spring and a late summer generation or emergence. And our climate is currently probably not reliable enough or reliably hot enough to enable them to do that. It's also what we could call an obligate disperser. So when it emerges, it has this innate desire to fly away somewhere different. That, of course, helps it with its sort of migration or migrant status to turn up in new places. But really dispersal rather than migration is the correct term. So we identify these by a combination of red wings, red veins, yes, not always easy to see. A single pale flash on the side of the thorax there. A very heavily marked wing spot, so really dark margins front and aft, and blue under the eyes. So that's quite a difficult feature to see, but a very useful one if you can see it. So it helps to be down low and look from actually behind the dragonfly to see that. And there you can see the very sparse and mainly coastal distribution of this species, but it has been seen in the last couple of years at Meath and could turn up anywhere, actually. And it has been seen egg laying at Meath. So we await the coming season with bated breath. There's the female for comparison. So you can see blue under the eyes, the heavily marked wing spot, but a rather strange pale yellowy, greeny, bluey side to the thorax. At Meath, there are a couple of old settlement, well, actually 4 old settlement ponds tucked away in one corner of the reserve. And these are virtually the only place in North Devon for the small red damselfly. Now, the small red damselfly, small red is all red, so it has no black markings towards the tip of the abdomen. It is very small, one of our smallest species, and it has pinky red legs and wing spots, not black as in the large red damselfly. And it tends to emerge and be found during the middle of summer rather than early in the season. And there you can see it's nationally scarce, and it's very much a habitat specialist. It's often found in acidic, boggy areas, and there are some good sites for it on Dartmoor, for example. Rivers, this is a nice lowland river, the River Axe, in fact, near Seaton in South Devon. But lowland rivers are the location for banded demoiselles. We have 2 species of demoiselle. The banded likes watercourses, rivers, and streams, brooks, sometimes drains with slow-flowing water and muddy sediment at the bottom. And the larvae are associated with those muddy bottoms to the watercourses. The males have this very distinctive iridescent band across the wings. In contrast, the beautiful demoiselle has completely dark wings. And the beautiful demoiselle is found where the watercourses, running waters again, have gravelly bottoms, so fast flowing rivers and streams. And we have a lot of those in Devon. So these are our most widespread demoiselle. The female, let's look at distributions. So first of all, the beautiful demoiselle, rather southwesterly bias in Britain and Ireland, but thick on the ground over much of Devon. The banded demoiselle, by comparison, rather sparse in the West Country and mainly associated with the Exe and the Tamar and the Tortorridge. The females of these differentiated by their wing colour. So banded has a greenish hue. The beautiful demoiselle has this bronzy or brownish hue. Both of them have a white wing spot. It's technically not a pterostigma, it's known as a false wing spot, but nevertheless it's a useful identification feature for female demoiselles. The white-legged damselfly is invariably found in the company of banded demoiselle, but not everywhere that the banded demoiselle occurs. So like that species, it's found where the watercourse is sluggish, has mud accumulating, sediment, and often emergent plants like reed canary grass growing. So as its name suggests, it has very white looking legs. The tibiae are actually expanded more so than other damselflies. And unlike other blue damselflies, it has black patterning where there's often blue. It has a hockey stick, dare I say, rather than a billiard cue. So it has an extra black line that joins up and curls upwards in the manner of a hockey stick. And if we look at the wing spot, we'll see it's not black or two-tone, but orangey brown. So quite a localized species of damselfly, found often in nettle beds and other tall vegetation on the banks of slow-flowing watercourses. Females are paler, often rather ghostly white. And there's a distribution. It's a species that's been increasing and spreading, but not noticeably so in the West Country. The golden ringed I've talked about earlier on. It is a very distinctive species with these broad and narrow bands of gold around the abdomen. It also has beautiful green eyes, and the female has this very long spike of a tail. The ovipositor is spiked. So that technically, that makes her the longest British dragonfly, even longer than the emperor. So quite impressive insects, the golden ringed dragonflies, and often fly up and down fast flowing gravelly streams and rivers. And often they will go past an observer and hang up, which many of the larger dragonflies won't do very often. So hang up, by that I mean it will perch on some waterside vegetation. And often they will have caught a hoverfly or a wasp, and they'll sit and munch away and let you get very close views of them. So beautiful things to get close up to. I should also add, if you haven't already twigged, all dragonflies are harmless to human beings. So there's the map of golden ringed, a very western distribution, and people who live in the Midlands and East Anglia yearn to come to Devon to see our golden ringed dragonflies because they are fairly widespread. Now here's one with the opposite. They're rare in the West Country, or relatively rare, but commoner in the east of Britain. What was perhaps rather inappropriately called the scarce chaser, maybe the not so scarce chaser now in Britain, but quite a recent history. It found its way into Devon. The nearest known sites were 90 kilometres away back in the noughties, and it's now quite well established in a few locations. So the only one, strictly speaking, in North Devon is half of the Grand Western Canal in mid-Devon. But one to look out for, there have been records in Cornwall and in North Somerset. So it's possible it could turn up. The sort of, let's talk about why it is one. Little bit of black at the wing bases, often quite difficult to see unless you're looking straight down on it. So it can look very like the black-tailed skimmer, but it never perches on the ground. The black-tailed skimmer almost invariably perches on the ground. It has blue-grey eyes instead of greenish eyes. Often, but not always, some smokiness at the wingtips. Its habitat tends to be well vegetated margins to drains, or in this case, canals. So this is the Grand Western Canal, and a good population of scarce chasers here now. There's the distribution map. So again, I think one to keep your eyes open for. Beautiful, immature scarce chaser with beautiful ochre coloration in the wings and on the abdomen, and then a series of black bell shapes down the center of the abdomen. These are quite dispersive, and it's possible these might turn up before any mature adult is seen. This is a couple of the ponds at Braunton Burrows, and I mentioned these. I mentioned ruddy data occurring at a few of these. At least about 15 years ago, they were found here, may still occur here. But a couple of years ago, Tom Parsons found this species laying eggs at one of those ponds at Braunton. It's one I've always thought should be on Braunton Marsh in the ditches. But anyway, it's a species that appears to be spreading, doing very well in Britain. The hairy dragonfly is unusual as a hawker in that it's an early emerging species. So it's often on the wing in April, May into June, before the other hawkers, the southern hawker and the migrant hawker, even emerge. Here's a pair of them mating. You can see very intricate patterns on the thorax and the abdomen. Yellow wing veins that are quite distinctive too. And there's the map. So quite a wide distribution, but formerly very localized, and even now still quite localized. So I think the main headquarters in the West Country are the Somerset Levels and the marshes around the head of the Exe estuary. Sorry, I should have said that's an old map, so it doesn't have your Braunton spot on it. Heathland, because it's acidic, has these lovely fish-free ponds. Here's one with a lot of bog pondweed and cotton grass growing around it, and sphagnum. And here we might find things like the keeled skimmer. And Devon has particularly good populations of keeled skimmer on the mires of Dartmoor and to some extent Exmoor, and also some of the lowland heathy areas, possibly also some of the Colne grassland sites that are still boggy and heathy. The keeled skimmer, so a rather specialist of certain heathy habitats, wet heathland, has orange wing spots. The black-tailed skimmer, which you wouldn't expect to see in these habitats, has a black wing spot. Again, no dark at the wing bases like the chasers have got, but it does have this pruinose blue abdomen. The keel is that little thin line. I'm afraid keel skimmer is a rubbish name. They really ought to be called heathland skimmer. And there's the map. So really a Western speciality. Some of the heathlands in the New Forest and Surrey, for example, also have them, but we have some good sites for them here. So quite a small dragonfly worth looking out for. Female lacks the pruinosity, so no of that pale blue coloration. Very rich ochre, lovely yellow wing veins. See those little yellow wing veins in the wings. There's the keel, a little bit more obvious perhaps. And these yellow little antinodal veins, they're called, and these are characteristic of keeled skimmer and black-tailed skimmer. And some also have a bolder pattern on the thorax with these pale stripes. So let's go right up onto, in this case, the top of Dartmoor, onto the Blanket Bog, where there are some rather nice pools, and to a limited extent also on Exmoor. And here we find the black darter. So this darter, rather than being red, turns black in the case of the male with very limited areas of yellow. It's a late occurring species, so it's on the wing August, September into October. Females rather rich golden yellow with quite extensive black markings. They also have a black patch on the top of the thorax. It's actually triangular in shape and quite extensive black along the side of the abdomen. And they also have a black panel on the side of the thorax with 3 yellow spots within it. So lovely little species, our smallest dragonfly species, in fact. And we do have fair populations of them in the southwest, but more strong populations in the moorlands of Wales and northern Britain and Ireland. Common hawker is another species that is very badly named because it isn't common until you get up on to moorland. And on the higher moorland areas where the bog mosses, the sphagnum grows, this is going to be your default late summer dragonfly, the common hawker, with lots of lovely blue patterning. Has a yellow costa, a yellow wing vein. It's got its headlights on, but they're not on main beam like the southern hawker. And it has paired spots all the way down the abdomen, and no sign really of a golf tee, a triangle at the base of the abdomen. It's also mainly a species of the North and West. Some lowland heathlands have it. A lot of those dots, I hate to say it, on the distribution map in the lowlands are almost certainly not common hawkers. They're probably migrant hawkers that have been misidentified, because migrant hawker can be quite common and people see it and see a lot of them and assume it's the common hawker. So please beware, a common hawker or moorland hawker, let's call it, is not common mostly. Okay, so I've ended up with a couple of upland species that we are concerned might be in decline, not just in Devon, but in Britain more widely and in Ireland too, as a result of climate change. So we're seeing some species coming in, invading Britain, some species moving north within Britain, but also others probably retreating northwards. Now I've produced at the beginning of this year a summary of the status of dragonflies in Devon. You can download it from the British Dragonfly Society website. There is a Devon page and a link to both that publication and also any meetings that might be coming up in the future, field meetings. There are also a couple of presentations that I've recorded and put on YouTube. So there are videos of effectively this presentation split into two and expanded somewhat. So if you wish to, at your leisure, go to YouTube and watch an introduction, which was really the first part of this talk, or look at the dragonflies of all of Devon, including the south, in a bit more detail, then by all means have a look at those. A final word again about the British Dragonfly Society. We've been around for over 35 years now, and are the organisation concerned with dragonfly recording and conservation in Britain. And there you can see we would welcome your sightings. Generally, we ask people to send them in via iRecord, which is run by the Biological Records Centre of Britain. But of course, you can also send them to Devon Biodiversity Records Centre. And I do periodic data exchanges with DBRC, so we make sure we've all got everything. And if you want to view the records, indeed not just for Devon, but all over the country, then the NBN Atlas, the National Biodiversity Network Atlas, is a way to view those data. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, David. That was absolutely fascinating.